All right, so get ready, because today we are diving deep into the world of Joshua Wade.
Oh, this is a fascinating case.
It really is. And, he was a convicted killer in Alaska.
Yeah.
But it's not as simple as that, right?
Uh,
Because the thing that makes this case so unsettling is that he later confessed to even more murders after he was already in prison.
right.
Like, why?
Yeah.
What would push someone to do that?
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we've got court records, news reports, even analysis from some true crime TV shows.
Yeah.
And all of this is coming from his Wikipedia page. So we're going to use all that to try and answer that question. Why?
That's a good question.
What makes someone confess after they've already made a deal to avoid the death penalty? It's wild.
Like, what's the point? You've already kind of won, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's a question that really gets at the heart of criminal psychology.
Sure.
And there's rarely just one simple answer. But
Yeah.
let's start with the basics, right? So, Joshua Wade, his life began in Montana, but his family moved to Alaska when he was just a kid.
Gotcha.
And his childhood was, well, to put it lightly, incredibly rough.
Yeah, I was reading about that.
We're talking sexual abuse that started at age 5,
Oh, wow.
a mother who was struggling to cope, and a strained relationship with his father.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder how much his early life, like those early experiences,
Yeah.
really shaped the path that he ended up on.
Absolutely. Trauma.
Yeah.
Especially in those really, formative years,
Yeah.
It can have such a profound impact on development.
Right.
It can, distort a person's sense of self,
Yeah.
their relationships,
It-
even their ability to manage their emotions.
It makes you wonder how much of his later actions were, I don't know,
Right.
like a direct result of all that.
Yeah, and it's, obviously it's not an excuse for violence.
Of course not.
Of course not, but
But it's important to know that background
it's crucial.
to even begin to try to understand this guy.
Yeah, if we want to, unpack Wade's actions later on.
Right. And speaking of his actions,
Mm-hmm.
didn't those start super early? Like he was just a teenager when he admitted to his first killings.
That's right. He was very young. He confessed to killing 2 men,
Wow.
John Michael Martin and Henry Onctuous Rook.
And from what I read, it seemed like these were like random victims,
Seemingly random, yeah.
like not connected to him at all.
Not in any obvious way, no.
And this is where I really start to get interested because the randomness, I don't know, it raises the question,
Yeah.
were these like truly just impulsive acts
Yeah.
or is there some kind of pattern that we're just not seeing? Like, for example, I read that John Michael Martin was last seen leaving a village inn after having coffee with some friends.
Oh, okay.
And that suggests maybe a routine,
Right.
like maybe a pattern that Wade might have noticed and been aware of.
That is a chilling thought.
It is. It's a very chilling thought, and it suggests a level of premeditation, which is even more disturbing when you consider how young he was at the time.
Yeah.
But then just a few years later, we've got the case of Della Brown.
Oh, yeah, Della Brown. This is where it gets...
Yeah.
This is where the legal system gets really tangled in a way that's just really hard to stomach.
Yeah.
So Roe v. Wade, he bragged about killing Della Brown, who, from what we know, was an Alaskan Native woman.
Right.
And she was struggling with addiction.
Yeah.
And he even showed her body to other people.
He would.
Yeah, he showed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And despite all of that, he was acquitted at trial.
Hold on. How is that even possible?
I know.
Like, he confessed there were witnesses.
Right. It seems...
What went wrong?
Well, so the prosecution had some serious obstacles in this case.
Right.
There was a real lack of physical evidence that directly linked Roe v. Wade to the crime scene.
Oh?
And then to make things even worse, the defense really went after the credibility of the witnesses. And these witnesses, unfortunately, they were themselves involved in criminal activity.
And that, unfortunately casts doubt on their testimony in the eyes of the law.
So even with a confession and even with witnesses, the system couldn't get justice.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
That must have been just devastating for anyone who knew Della Brown.
Absolutely, and it brings up a really important question.
Yeah.
What does justice really even mean when the legal system just fails to hold someone accountable?
Right.
Even when there's a strong suspicion of guilt.
Yeah.
The Della Brown case is just a stark example of how complex and sometimes imperfect the justice system can be.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with cases that involve vulnerable victims.
I don't even know what to say.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one.
And it gets even more disturbing because, Wade also claimed there was another victim.
Oh,
an unidentified man who was with Della Brown at the time, and he even described a particularly brutal method that he used to kill him.
Oh, gosh.
So not only did he escape the consequences for Della Brown's death,
but there's also potentially another unsolved murder out there.
right?
It adds another layer of, like, complexity and tragedy to this story.
It does.
And it makes you think, like, did getting away with it, did that embolden him in some way?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, did this experience where the system failed to hold him accountable, did that, like, influence his actions later on?
That's a question that we'll have to explore further, as we go deeper into his later crimes and confessions.
Right.
But what we see here, unfortunately, is just like a pattern of violence and a disturbing lack of accountability that is unfortunately going to continue to unfold in the years to come.
This is just the beginning.
Yeah. It's crazy to think about, right? Like, he just got away with it.
I know. It's, like, almost unbelievable.
And you have to think about the victims' families,
Absolutely. Like, just left with no answers.
Just this gaping hole.
Totally.
And it's scary to think he could have just gone back to his life, like nothing happened.
Right. Just blended back into society.
Yeah.
Maybe even, I don't know, hurt other people.
Yeah. It's a terrifying thought, but thankfully, years later, something happened.
What happened?
Well, this brings us to Mindy Schloss.
Years passed before Wade was connected to another murder.
That's right.
And that was Mindy Schloss.
Yes, Mindy Schloss. She was a nurse practitioner living in Anchorage.
And from what I remember, she ended up being Wade's neighbor.
Tragically, yes, they were neighbors.
This case, it's different, right?
Very different, yeah.
Like, it wasn't just a random act of violence.
No.
It wasn't some, I don't know, crime of passion.
It felt very planned.
Yeah, it sounds like Wade actually planned this attack on Schloss.
He did. He robbed her, kidnapped her, shot her, and then, and then he tried to cover his tracks by burning her body.
He burned her body.
Yeah, and, like, get this, he even forced her to give up her ATM pin before he killed her.
Oh my gosh, that's awful. It sounds like he was trying to be so much more careful this time.
Right, like he learned from what happened with Della Brown.
Yeah, like he'd studied the system and figured out how to get away with it.
Right, almost like he was taking notes.
But luckily, his plan to cover his tracks, it wasn't as good as he thought it was.
No, not at all. And this is where we really see the advancements in forensic technology coming into play.
Oh, interesting.
Back then, it was blurry fingerprints and vague eyewitness accounts.
Right.
But now, we've got things like surveillance cameras.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah, and they had cameras at the ATM where Wade used Schloss's card.
So they got him on camera.
Clear images of him.
Wow.
And then you've got DNA evidence that was found in Schloss's car, placing him directly at the scene.
So it's like they had irrefutable proof this time.
Yeah, they had him dead to rights.
Wow, so they finally got him.
It seemed that way, but here's where things get really strange.
What do you mean?
Well, he was facing the death penalty, right?
Yeah.
So you'd think he'd fight tooth and nail to get out of it.
I would, absolutely.
But instead, he took a plea deal.
A plea deal.
Yeah, he confessed to murdering both Mindy Schloss and Della Brown.
Wait, so he confessed to a murder he was already acquitted for?
He did, and all of that in exchange for life sentences.
That doesn't make sense. Like, why? Why would he confess after fighting so hard to deny everything before?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
Like, he could have tried to fight the charges, especially since the Della Brown case had already resulted in an acquittal.
Exactly. So what was he thinking?
It's tough to say for sure, but things get even more complicated.
How so?
Well, later on, he confessed to 3 more murders.
30 more?
Yeah, and the motive for those confessions seems to have been just to get transferred to a federal prison.
So it was just about getting a better living situation.
That's what it looks like, at least on the surface.
So what are we supposed to make of all of this? Was there any actual remorse there, or was he just manipulating the system?
It's almost like he was using these confessions like bargaining chips.
Yeah, trading them in for a change of scenery.
Right, or maybe even just like some kind of notoriety within the prison system.
It's a very chilling thought.
It is. It makes you wonder what's really going on in the minds of people like Wade.
And to make it even more complicated, the man he claimed to have killed alongside Della Brown, they still haven't identified him.
No, and we still don't know if there are other victims out there.
So even with his confessions, and even with his conviction, there's still so much we don't know.
Exactly, and that's what makes this case so unsettling.
It's like he left behind this tangled web of unanswered questions.
A puzzle with missing pieces.
And it just leaves you feeling like there's still so much darkness to uncover. I mean, it's just so bizarre, right?
Mm-hmm.
confessing to more crimes after you've already made a deal.
It's not something you see every day.
It really makes you think, like, was this some kind of power play?
Yeah, like what was he trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Researchers have actually been trying to figure this out for years.
Yeah.
Yeah, when it comes to serial killers, especially those who confess after they've already been convicted, there's often this, deep need for control.
Control.
That goes way beyond the initial crimes.
So, like, even in prison, they're still trying to control things.
Exactly. You got to imagine being locked up. You've lost all your freedom.
Yeah.
Every single move is dictated by someone else.
Yeah.
So in that situation, confessing, even to horrible things, it becomes a way to exert control again.
So it's like, I decide what you know.
Exactly.
Even if it's something awful.
Right. It's like they're saying, I decide what gets revealed.
Even though they're behind bars.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost like confessing becomes its own, sick form of agency.
It is. It's like they refuse to just fade into the background. They want to be the center of attention.
They want to control the narrative.
They want to control their story.
Wow. Even if it's a horrific story.
Exactly.
It really makes you question, how is society supposed to deal with someone like that?
Right. It's a challenge for sure.
How do you punish someone who seems to, get something out of confessing?
Yeah, how do you deter that kind of behavior?
And, in the middle of all this, the legal stuff, the psychology, we can't forget about the human cost.
Oh, absolutely.
There are families out there.
Yeah.
Entire communities who were terrorized by this guy.
Yeah, and for them, there are no easy answers.
And we still don't even know if there are more victims out there.
Right, and that's the thing. Even with Wade gone now.
Yeah, he died in prison, right?
Last year, yeah.
But it's like the scars he left behind, they're still there.
They're still impacting people's lives.
Exactly, and that's why these cases are so important.
To study, to try and understand.
They force us to, look at the dark side of humanity.
To try to understand what makes someone capable of these kinds of things.
And hopefully to figure out how to prevent them from happening again.
That's the goal.
So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this.
Yeah.
As we explored Wade's story, we found more questions than answers.
I think that's always the case with these kinds of deep dives.
What makes someone choose that path? How can we as a society address the root causes of these crimes?
These are big questions.
They are, and we encourage you to keep thinking about them, keep learning.
There are so many resources out there.
Delve into the research, explore the different perspectives on this because it's complicated.
Very complicated.
But only through understanding can we really begin to heal.
And hopefully start working towards a world where these kinds of things don't happen anymore.
A safer world, a more just world.
That's what we all want.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.